Hi there, this is Niall from the History Machine podcast. I'm here to give a quick recommendation for the quality audio work that is the Forgotten History podcast. If you've ever wondered about some unknown juggernauts of history, the kinds of people who are responsible for placing world leaders and implementing changes that are still reverberating with us today, whose exceptional abilities and actions have shaped and woven the modern world as we know it, then you've come to the right place. The Forgotten History podcast.
Welcome to The Forgotten, Season 3, Episode 2, From Student to Socialist. The political climate in Chile of 1925 was a rather tense one. President Allende was constantly under pressure by the man that had lifted him back into office after the coup of September 11, 1924, Colonel Carlos Ibáñez del Campo, his Minister of War. Indeed, the already reinstated president feared a second coup might be coming and resigned in 1925. His successors were rather weak puppets of Ibáñez himself, and indeed, in 1927, he deposed his marionette and held new elections. The problem? No one except the Communist Party, which he had already legalized once before, dared to oppose him. After he won the election with a 98% support, he subsequently illegalized the Communist Party again and exiled their leader to the Easter Islands. Ibáñez's character was a rather interesting one. The cunning and industrious schemer and power politician, however, was considered a fascist by some. Others even claimed that the man liked to be called the Mussolini of the New World. His policies, however, differed massively from the ones Alessandria tried to punch through. He instituted a new special police force, the Carabineros, for which he oriented on the Italian fascist black shirts, and which did not really support public order and lawfulness like normal policemen do, but rather functioned like a state-funded and state-armed version of the SA and SS in Nazi Germany before 1933. Prosecution of political opponents, violent destruction of property, brawls and crackdowns on strikes were all on the menu. Yet some of his former supporters turned against him. Marmaduke Grove, one of his closest allies during the putsch of 1924, was appalled by the methods used and decided to flee Chile, going to exile into Buenos Aires. Whatever we might think of this new dictatorship, Salvador Allende's personal opinion, especially measured on what was to hit Latin America later on, during and after his life, is rather mild. In a later interview in 1971 with Régis Debray, someone we will lose a word or two about later, he described the Ibáñez years as benign and atypical for Latin American dictatorships. Although all of this we have heard before sounds rather horrible, there were no organized murders, indeed very few people died during the first years of Ibáñez's presidency, and political prosecution, while indeed existent, did not always result in banishment or execution. There were lots of amnesties and the sentences were in general rather mild. Chicho, as he was known by his childhood nickname, himself quickly began his political activism during those years. He joined a student organization called Avance, literally attack, and organized readings of leftist literature from Marx to Lenin. He quickly became known for being able to memorize entire chapters of those books after hearing them only once, using his extremely good memory. According to Clark's book, it does appear like the other leaders of Avance did enjoy Allende's company and support, especially because he was able to convince quite a lot of female students and workers to support Avance. I'll leave the rest up to your imagination. As you might have imagined by the year we're in, it wasn't for long until this benign dictatorship met some serious problems. The same problems the entire world was facing. Let me give you a hint. It has something to do with money, and it was in nowhere their fault. Exactly, the Great Depression. The Depression hit the Ibáñez regime especially hard for several reasons. Firstly, Chile was a country, as I have remarked in the last episode, heavily dependent on exports of nitrates and copper, but simultaneously extremely dependent on imports of other metals and raw goods. Yet over the years of the Great Depression, especially in 1929, inter-American exports fell by around 2%, and imports even by 4%, While this of course does not sound like too much, Chile especially was struck hard. There was hardly any Latin American country with a larger dependence on foreign trade and with a weaker domestic market. The second reason, very much connected to it, was Ibáñez's personal goal of subduing the national nitrate industry to a giant monopoly corporation, the Compañía de Salitre de Chile, the Chilean Nitrate Company, abbreviated as COSAC. This project, however, was incredibly expensive, especially relying on foreign investment. Not only had the main force of financial influence changed from Britain to the US over the course of his puppet president's terms, a result of the weak trade support infrastructure the British government provided, but his supporters themselves had become rather cautious or outright unable to invest into his endeavor. As such, the failure of COSAC was imminent. The attempt of its implementation, however, was a big disaster, costing thousands of jobs and money that could have been used to placate the unruly populace at home. The populace was becoming even unrulier when, as happened all over the world, their savings, if they had any, were eaten up by inflation, and the cost of life rose sharply. Marmaduke Grove, who thought this to be an ideal point to restart his political career by deposing Ibáñez, was captured as soon as stepping out of his plane after landing in Santiago and banished to the Easter Isles as well. Salvador Allende had been living at his aunt's house for quite a while over the course of 1928, but quickly discovered that this would make him an outcast. All other medical students grouped together in a district close to the Vega Market, one of the poorer neighborhoods of the city. So he quickly left the cozy home and moved into a shabby house in the center of this district. Being surrounded by poverty would be something that would coin him for all his life. Furthermore, his father fell ill, suffering from diabetes and unable to provide for the family. Young Salvador had to provide for himself. So, being in his first semesters of study, he decided to take up a job at a Santiago's hospital morgue, preparing and dissecting corpses, as well as 2 other jobs at a night school and a psychiatry. Nonetheless, he somehow found the energy to continue his activism. In 1930, the FECH student organization was reopened after the Carabineros had shut it down. The reopening, without permission by Ibáñez or anyone else in the government of course, is described as such. The still small Avante group had its speakers booed off the stage. In a somewhat desperate move, Avante leaders decided to put Allende forward to speak, because he looked like a toff and was relatively unknown. Hundreds of students filled the hall, whistling and shouting. Allende put his left hand into his jacket, raised his right hand and began, "Gentlemen!" A stunned silence followed. This revolutionary had committed the heresy of not calling his fellow comrades. Allende then spoke, avoiding the revolutionary slogans beloved of his friends, turning the debate into one of freedom of speech and political liberty. Whatever it was that cast a spell on his comrades, it worked brilliantly. He was subsequently elected vice president of the new FECH, an extremely influential position. Yet all this newfound attention had a detrimental effect on Allende's ability to study. Indeed, he was incarcerated after an incident in which a young student standing together with 2 others was shot and fatally wounded by carabineros. In an attempt to wipe out the new students' resistance, all their leaders were put into prison. After the situation threatened to raise even more students to open resistance, Ibáñez proclaimed a general amnesty, which led to those leaders further rousing their comrades and workers, so much that on July 14, 1931, Salvador Allende and many of his friends went to the university and outright occupied it. Not in the mask-wearing and chanting plus drumming way of recent Occupy movements, but rather armed and in the "you want to evict us, we shoot you" and chanting kind of way. After several firefights with carabineros, of which I could not find a certain death toll, the forces of the government retreated. The message soon spread like a wildfire. Workers put down their labor, then teachers, then merchants and clerks. Soon, civil servants and even parts of the regular police followed. Only a little more than a week later, on the 26th, hundreds of thousands protested the government and publicly mourned the dead of the recent struggles with carabineros trying to break up their demonstration. Ibáñez had no choice but to step down from power. A new age of freedom for the people of Chile was imminent. Or was it? The new president, unelected of course and taking over from Ibáñez's also unelected successor Montero, was Manuel Trucco. Trucco himself, however, was only a puppet. Montero himself was officially not allowed to be a candidate for the upcoming elections while being in office, so he handed over. He won the elections the same way Ibáñez had, gathering support from the Radical Party and banishing other socialist candidates. In Trucco's short reign, however, fell an event that would confuse the new and bold resistance from the left: the Great Sailors' Mutiny of 1931. Following Trucco's policy of cutting state expenses, the sailors' wages were cut by almost 30%. In an era of rampant inflation, this was close to a death sentence. While violent fighting erupted in the ports, the FOCH and FECH, emboldened but still weakened by the years of oppression, tried to assemble the working classes again in support of the uprising. The Chilean populace, however, content that Ibáñez was done for, had had their fair share of revolution and didn't follow their appeals. Subsequently, the mutiny was put down in a matter of days, very much to the disturbance of communists and socialists across the country and at the university. Conservative circles had even attempted to arm several right-wing organizations to quell the Bolshevik uprising of the Navy. As such, the communists were voting for open class warfare, while moderate socialists like Allende openly supported leaving the violent uprising to fight for its own. A dangerous situation. Avante, now at the forefront of the discussion for the socialists, decided to throw out Allende for his reformist opinions, a root of his further dislike of sectarianism and socialist dogmatism. It would befit this show to go for a clear-cut definition of Salvador Allende's beliefs now, yet I dislike putting up a distinct picture of this person before fully explaining his story, especially because I would cause you and myself to look at his actions in a distinct way, and could not decide whether he really acted out of character, if he did. Even worse, we could start judging the person against their own character. As such, I will only point out certain traits of his ideology at first, and we will discover his real political attitudes, which were, of course, subject to change later on. Salvador Allende was a human opposed to dogma. In the interview with Debray in 1971, he said that he did indeed admire some of the parts of every work, and that he especially considered parts of Lenin's works as a good advice in the perception of state and revolution, yet he always considered it important to make none of these works a catechism, as he called it. His views were Marxist-Leninist, and they weren't. He was the definition of an idealist. He thought that a revolution could never depict a united people, as Lenin had presumed in his works, but he thought that socialism was not to be achieved by violence and revolution, but rather by democratic means, something which would indeed coin his life more than anything else. Therefore, he was among the first to argue that a united front of all leftist movements would be necessary, be they communist or else. Yet his political career had ground to a halt. In late 1931, he was even expelled from university for being a leftist. Only after a few months, in January 1932, was he readmitted. Seeing his influence on the university politics go down the drain, he decided to finish his dissertation at home, at Valparaiso. Furthermore, he could also be near his father, whose condition worsened by the hour. So, in June 1932, he was not at the capital when the next major upheaval in Chilean history would take place, or, as Mike Duncan would say, the next apple cart was overturned. Remember the man who shares a name with a cartoon dog, Marmaduke Grove? Following an amnesty by President Montero, who still did not manage to restore the Republic's economy the way he wanted, he was greeted like a pop star. And Montero, knowing that this popular figure was a good poster child, made him head of the Air Force. Grove himself did not intend to stick to Montero, however. On June 4th, 1932, he went to the Moneda, just like Ibáñez and his buddies had done a few years earlier, and told Montero to, well, get out of the palace or be carried out in a body bag. Montero, seeing that Air Force and Army were in open rebellion, and knowing that the Navy would not respond too kindly to his pleas for help after what his predecessor Trucco had done to them, unsurprisingly complied. On the morning of June 6, 1932, Marmaduke Grove proclaimed the Socialist Republic of Chile, and instated himself as a new Minister of War in a new military junta. One of the big problems was that Grove himself had no real socialist program and was not too much of a socialist altogether. There was no real sign of him being a socialist until the day before the putsch. Instead, he was some kind of a social romantic who did value personal freedom above all, yet still believed that, somehow, everybody would contribute to the greater good by their own free will. It is easily imaginable that this crude logic did not sit too well with the socialists and communists of FECH and FOCH, yet his slogan, bread, roof and clothing, probably sounded a little too good for the leftists' ears. Furthermore, his junta was as unstable as the first one had been. It would be a terribly long story to explain what happened, so let's take the short version. Grove's junta only existed for about 12 days. He then was pushed out of power by Carlos Davila, who, while an old friend of Ibáñez and his ambassador to the US, kept up the socialist charade for another 100 days. He was then subsequently ousted by another member of the first putsch, Bartolomé Blanch, who, fearful of his new power and pressured by the military and the people to, hey, for a change, hold an election, did comply. And guess who came back now? Let me give you a hint. He had been president of Chile twice before, and both times did not end too well for him. Well, here you are. It's Arturo Alessandri. Over the course of Grove's coup, he did support the new socialist junta, knowing that it would fall out of sheer inexperience. But he was a personal friend of Grove, so what could go wrong? The old fox did indeed manage to get back into power. So, was the Socialist Republic of 100 Days, as it is remembered, really all for nothing? No. And Salvador Allende is one of the reasons for this. As Marmaduke Grove was evicted out of the Moneda, Davilla's men were more than keen to lock up all his supporters. As you might remember, Allende had known Marmaduke Grove for most of his life, and as such was considered, correctly, a friend and supporter. As such, he was seized by the police and put into a Valparaiso jail, facing possible banishment to the Easter Islands as well. Yet one night he was suddenly allowed to leave his cell. His father was dying, and he and his brother were allowed to see him one last time. Allende, in the interview with Debray, presented his recollection of the last talk. My father was unwell. He had a leg amputated and symptoms of gangrene in the other. As a doctor, I realized just how serious his condition was. I was able to talk to him for a few minutes, and he managed to tell us that all he had to leave us was a clean, honest upbringing. He had no material wealth. He died the next day, and at his funeral, I made the promise that I would dedicate my life to the social struggle, and I believe that I have fulfilled that promise. The young man would continue to fight for his oath, which would lead him onto the great stage of Chilean politics, the foundation of the Socialist Party of Chile. As soon as the dust settled over the death of the Socialist Republic and Marmaduke Grove was back on the stage, he was indeed elected a member of the Senate while he was still in jail, the Chilean socialists pretty quickly realized why they had failed. They were unable to muster popular support for lack of vehicle to do so. A party needed to be founded. While Salvador, once again a free man, was not able to attend the main Congress in Santiago on 19th April 1933, he still prepared and presided over the founding Congress in Valparaiso, the second largest city of the country. This new socialist party, the Partido Socialista de Chile, or PS, was a mixture of all political beliefs of the socialist and communist left. While the Communist Party had already existed since 1922, Allende called them closed and inward-looking and vowed for a socialist party with a broader approach. So, in this party, both socialists, Marxists, romantics like Grove, reformers and revolutionaries all found their homes. Marmaduke Grove scored the second most direct presidential votes, and the party had resounding success with a small group in the Congress and some deputies to the Senate, especially given that this was its first election. Alessandri himself did not do anything to obstruct their vote and remained a close friend of Grove. Salvador Allende was now among the prime leaders of the Socialist Party, being close friends with its chairman and being chairman of the Valparaiso branch itself. Yet he was not yet destined to take up Grove's mantle as quickly. Over the course of the year 1932, he had finished his dissertation called Mental Hygiene and Crime. This would open him new doors into the political world, yet we will discover this new world later on, during the presidencies of Alessandri and his successor. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of my show. And I want to say thank you for the message by the great History Machine podcast that aired before it. I blushed a little upon first hearing it. Be sure to check out this show as well, probably the most interesting take on a history podcast you'll find on historymachinepodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, I would like to ask you to add this show to your probably already packed folder of podcasts via subscribing and also reviewing the show wherever you might listen to it. Next week, we'll delve into the first public office Salvador Allende would ever take up during the phase of the first Popular Coalition. I wish you a good day or a good night. See you next time.